Okay, well, here we are. Welcome to Breaking Dimension.
So it's a great pleasure to be here. What an amazing event, and it's always a pleasure to be in Canterbury, home of some of my favourite psychedelic bands. So very good. It's a bit of a pilgrimage for me, an alternative pilgrimage. So last summer I had a very enjoyable time touring British festivals, talking about my book, and it was a great ticket to have. And I think it was when I got to Buddhafield that I bumped into Julio. Julio's here. Hello, Julio. And we'd been sparring at sunrise. And Julio came up to me and he said, I know what it is with you. I can't argue with you. You're a postmodernist. And he's right. I'm deeply influenced by postmodern theory in my approach to psychedelics. And hopefully, as my talk progresses, you'll understand why. But hopefully this won't preclude you from arguing with me. If you forgive me, I'm going to call it a postmodern project. That itself would be disputed. But basically what postmodernism is about is reason turning back on itself. It's asking the question, what are the limits of knowledge? What is it possible for us to know? And most importantly of all, how does knowledge constitute relationships of power? How does relations of power constitute knowledge? And it leads us to a profoundly uncertain place. And I find the postmodern project psychedelic in that sense. It encourages uncertainty. It's the great other unknown revolution of the 60s. We all know about the psychedelic revolution, but there was this revolution in thought that took place from the 1960s onwards, and it's bequeathed us a body of what we call critical theory. And here are just some of the disciplines that have been completely shaken up by critical theory, by postmodern thought. Here we are in the academy. We're at a university conference, and this is absolutely wonderful that psychedelic research is finding its way back into the academy at last. But I would argue that there's a risk that because of this 40-year hiatus, that we simply start where we left off in the 1960s. And 1960s psychedelic research was absolutely wedded to what we would call the modernist project. This is the idea that there is a truth out there, a singular, essential truth, and that we have the means and the capability of finding it out. What I would argue that we need is a critical study of psychedelics. This is what I would like to see return to the academy. Forgive the name. I'm calling it Psycrit. It's a horrible name. Let me put some flesh on these abstract bones. An example from my own discipline, which is the study of religion. If the humanities perches precariously on the edge of academe, then the study of religions is dangling right over the edge. It's the discipline that's about to get snipped out, I think, to our detriment, but there you go. So one of the questions that the study of religion has been interested in is mysticism, obviously of great relevance to us today. And there are basically two approaches to the study of mysticism, what we could call the realist approach and a social constructivist approach. And the realist approach goes like this, that mystics have their experiences, they have their mystical experiences, and they talk about them. Or most importantly for scholars, they write them down. That's how we are able to talk about them. And they do so using a very particular, culturally specific language according to their time and their culture. However, in spite of that, behind the local variations, there is a common core. There's something essentially the same behind all mystical experiences. So we can work past the local variations to find the common core. And this is the realist position. So in other words, mystical experience is an objective thing. We can access it. There is such a thing as mystical experience. And a lot of work has been done from the realist position. One of the most influential books was by an American, W.T. Stace, published in 1960, Mysticism and Philosophy. And it influenced another researcher, Ralph Hood, who in 1975 published a paper where he put forward his Hood mysticism scale, the so-called M scale. And this is basically a questionnaire that you give to someone, and you can, in principle at least, measure and quantify the exact kind of mystical experience that they've had. So your mystical experience can be turned into a nice number, a nice p-value. That's the kind of thing that makes scientists frothy. Interestingly, I don't know if everyone saw the film last night about DMT, the spirit molecule, but I noticed just that the way the DMT experiences were cut together, it was done in such a way as to imply that there was an essential similarity between what people experienced. So the implication of the film was that the self-transforming machine elves and the hobby horses that fitted together and the winged angels were all in some sense the same thing. So that's a realist position. That's what the film was doing. There's another radically different way of looking at mysticism, and that is the social constructivist approach. And that begins from the assumption that there is no such thing as an unmediated experience. There is no naive experience. All experience is mediated by culture and expectation. So it's not possible to have a naive psychedelic experience, to give an example here, because it will always be interpreted. And in my study of magic mushrooms, the earliest historical accounts that I found were from the medical records, the British medical records. This is in Britain, sorry. And they were always interpreted within a discourse of poisoning, that the people concerned thought they'd been poisoned. So they didn't know about hallucinogenic mushrooms, they took them, they weren't having a naive experience, they were still interpreting the experience. And in the social constructivist view, accounts of mystical experience, they're not objects, they're culturally and historically bound texts. They have to be treated in a very particular way. The type, most importantly of all, the type of mystical experience that someone has depends on their cultural expectation. And to what, if anything, the experience points is not knowable other than by the person who had the experience, because experience is a private matter. At present, you can't get inside my head and know what I'm feeling or experiencing right now. And the book that really put this forward was published in 1978 by an edited collection by Stephen Katz, Mysticism and Philosophical Analysis. And he performs an absolutely exquisite analysis of concepts such as nothingness. If you think that all mystics are referring to the same thing when they talk about nothingness, read Katz's essay. And forensically, with beautiful philosophical precision, he unpicks the differences of meaning in concepts such as nothingness. And it should be obvious by now that I tend towards this social constructivist position. And I think Katz's analysis raises significant problems for the study of psychedelics and mysticism. I don't know how you measure it or how you get to that experience. In fact, I don't think it's possible. But what I'm interested in trying to do in my academic research, if you like, is trying to think this question, what does psychedelics mean? Or how is it that they become meaningful? And I'm interested, can we theorize psychedelic action? What I don't mean by that neuroscience or brain chemistry. I'm not talking about theory in a scientific sense. I'm talking about it in the humanities sense. My interest is in the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience. How and why does a psychedelic experience become meaningful? And in 2007, I published a paper, a discourse analysis, looking at the different ways people talk about their mushroom experiences, or their experiences occasioned by psilocybin mushrooms. And I asked the question, what are the main ways that people, what are the ways in which people do talk about their bemushroomed experiences? Well, there are essentially three different ways, broadly speaking. The first way is to say that mushroom experiences are meaningless. They have no meaning. It's like your cognitive processes have been damaged or impaired or broken in some way. And this traditionally is the kind of Daily Mail medical approach to psychedelics, that they impair consciousness, they're damaging, they're dangerous. They're meaningless. They have no meaning other than that they are socially dangerous. The second way that people tend to talk about experiences is to say that they are meaningful, but within a psychological discourse. So what they're saying is that whatever contents you have in your consciousness or your unconscious mind, they are rearranged in meaningful, interesting, or perhaps even therapeutically beneficial ways. This is very easy for us to get our heads around because we are absolutely imbued with psychological ways of speaking. Freudianism and Marxism were the two religions, I think, of the 20th century. We're absolutely au fait with psychological language. I don't know if anyone saw Inception, but they didn't have to point out that to go deeper into someone's mind, you literally go down into another level. We just took it for granted. We take it for granted. So this is, in a sense, not a problematical way for us. But there's a third way that people talk about psychedelics being meaningful, and that is that consciousness is presented with a genuine encounter with some other experience, be that mystical or shamanistic. So we might have an encounter with the Godhead, or the winged angels, or the self-transforming machine elves, or the spirit of a tree or a rock, or whatever it is. And the problem is, there's no way of deciding which is the correct one. From an academic point of view, I'm not saying, if someone comes to me and says, I saw self-transforming machine elves, fine, great, I don't have a problem with that. But the problem philosophically is, how can we ground that in anything? And we can't. So, for example, you're all, I'm sure, absolutely familiar with Aldous Huxley's famous mescaline experiment that he wrote about beautifully in The Doors of Perception. On a May day in 1954, he took mescaline in Los Angeles and had a mystical experience. He was craving a mystical experience, and boy, did he have one. Not so many people know about there weren't many, there were a handful of writers who thereafter took mescaline either to try and copy Huxley or to disprove him. And R.T. Zeiner was a professor at Oxford of comparative religion, an expert on Zoroastrianism, and a practicing Catholic. So you can imagine that the idea that, as Mike was saying, to take a chemical and have a mystical experience is deeply theologically problematic, because in Catholicism, mysticism is given by the grace of God. So he took mescaline in Oxford, and his account appears in the back of his book, The Sacred and the Profane, Mysticism, Sacred and the Profane, and he didn't really have a very good time. And I think mostly because he didn't get on with the people, with the scientists who kept asking him really irksome questions. Like, what's your concept of time? It's like, get off. But as a result of this, Zeiner said, okay, I'll grant that mescaline might produce a kind of mystical experience, but one that is nothing compared to the theistic, the genuine theistic experience. So he made a hierarchy. And at the bottom he put mystical experience that emerges through encounters with nature or with drugs. Then he talked about monistic mystical experience that comes from Eastern religions. And then at the top he put Christian theistic mystical experiences. How on earth is he able to do that? On what basis is he able to make that judgment? He's assuming that he has a privileged view of someone's experience, but experience is private. He can't do that. There is no Archimedes point from which we can move the world. So, how can we theorize the psychedelic experience in such a way that we can understand how it becomes meaningful? Well, here's an initial go. Brace yourselves, this is pretty full on. Psychedelics are such that they introduce novelty into consciousness. Bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Where novelty, as we know, is constrained by pharmacology, because it's a different trip taking acid to taking psilocybin to taking DMT, even though they're similar. And it's constrained by environment and expectation, set and setting. This is what I call the minimal theory. It's so minimal as to be absolutely meaningless. It's like saying 1 equals 1, or when you trip, you trip. It's so minimal as to get us absolutely nowhere. And I was pondering how we could take this further when I was at a talk by someone who'd published a book about music and the mind, music and meaning. And my cogs started turning. Anecdotally, at least, there has yet to be a human culture without these three things: music, religion, and drugs. Anecdotally. And the ways in which these three spheres, these three domains are interrelated is obviously the subject of anthropology, the study of religion, musicology, ethnomusicology, and so on. There's an appeal to thinking about the psychedelic experience in terms of music. Music is intangible. It unfolds through time. It takes us on a journey. As a metaphor, it seems to have something going for it. And in 1956, an American writer, Leonard B. Meyer, published this very significant book in the psychology of music, emotion and meaning in music. And Mayer was trying to theorize, where does the emotional content come from in music? Well, this won't turn into a music lecture, I promise. But from Beethoven to the Beatles, what composers have done is play with our cultural expectations of where music is going to go. So there are kind of rules of harmony. If you play a dominant 7 chord and have been brought up in the West, we expect it to resolve to the 1 chord. If I was to go dum da 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 dum, you'd all expect to go ba-dum-bum, okay? So that's the kind of thing. I could have taken it in another entirely different direction. And this is what is called the deceptive cadence. A cadence is that harmonic or melodic resolution, the grammar of music that we're brought up to expect. And what composers do is they go, you thought it was going that way, and we've gone, whoa, over here. Beatles do it, Beethoven does it. Caravan, local favourites, they did it a lot. And this, Mayer said, is the key to where meaning and emotion comes from in music. Emotion or affect, he said, is aroused when a tendency to respond is arrested or inhibited. So you're expecting to respond in a certain way, the music zigzags off in another direction, and that's where the meaning emerges, in that unexpected turn. I thought when I heard that. Maybe we can apply that to the psychedelic experience. What psychedelics do is they seem to introduce a continuous stream of novelty into consciousness, rather like hearing a new piece of music. And that novelty seems to be a deceptive cadence. I don't mean you're being deceived. I mean you expect experience to behave in a certain way, but that flower suddenly turns into a jeweled helmet, which turns into, oh my God, a winged serpent. It's constantly unfolding. And maybe that is where the meaning emerges. So like music, the psychedelic experience becomes meaningful because it arrests and inhibits tendencies to respond in exactly the same way that Mayer was talking about music. Meaning, in other words, emerges out of its deceptive cadences. Well, as a theory, it has advantages. It includes this idea of time, duration. The psychedelic experience isn't something static, it unfolds. And importantly, it includes cultural expectation, because remember, there is no such thing as naive experience, no such thing as unmediated experience. So that's built in, because it's our expectations that are being defied. The disadvantages are that as a metaphor, music implies, certainly to the Western mind, a score or a composer. That could be problematic. It also doesn't answer the question of where all that novelty comes from, which surely that's the $64 million question. Is it all in the mind, or is it coming from the self-transforming machine elves, the other side of, what was the thing, the door, the puzzle door, I can't remember, he said it beautifully. And finally, as a theory of music, it's crap. The music I would wager that we've all grown up listening to, rave, is not based on twisting our expectations. It's based on repetition, endless repetition. I remember when I was a student at Sheffield, one of the first kind of techno tracks I heard in the late 80s, the hook, I still remember the hook. It went like this. It was a Warp record, and I can't remember the name of the band, but the hook went deed, 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 deed. And I was like, wow! Don't stop! That's so good! I can still remember it. And I'm a folk musician. I'm a folk musician because the tunes are like that. They're repetitive. So it's deeply unsatisfying to have a theory that I think doesn't work so well for all forms of music. Surely it should all fit together beautifully. Maybe my project is doomed. Maybe language is a wholly inadequate tool to... I'm going to possibly stir up trouble here, but I think with a handful of exceptions, most drug writing is really bad. It has the opposite effect of what it sets out to do. People have this tremendum, and they're trying to communicate it with hyperbole and purple prose, and you end up feeling distanced from the experience. Fitzhugh Ludlow, I would say, is the worst offender. Music, on the other hand, is incredibly successful at conveying the psychedelic experience. That's why psychedelic music lives and thrives, and we all listen to it, and why it's so good at contouring and representing the trip. And that's why I'm hedging my bets, and I'm not just an academic, I'm a musician. The only way we have to grasp the psychedelic experience, or indeed anything in the abstract, is through metaphor. See what I did there? To grasp the psychedelic experience. It's not something you can pick up. I've used a metaphor from my concrete bodily existence to try and grab something that's very abstract. But the problem with the psychedelic experience is it is not like anything else. That's why it's interesting. To return to my initial point about critical psychedelic studies, what it asks us to do is to consider the metaphors that we use. It asks us to challenge cliches like ego loss. What does ego loss mean? I have no idea. Surely the drug that shreds the ego with most predictable effect is alcohol. But we don't think of it as a psychedelic drug. Mind expanding, again, it's the image of a balloon getting bigger. High, loaded, stoned, these are all cliches. And Psycrit invites us to consider how the metaphors we use constitute relations of power and make judgments. Who do they exclude? Who do they include? So the attempt to theorize psychedelic action may be doomed, but I would encourage you to try. Thank you.